Good evening to those in Jerusalem. Good afternoon to people in the United States and in Europe. I want to welcome you this evening to a very special program. My name is David Rosenson, and I have the privilege to direct Beit Avichai in Jerusalem. About a year ago, I sat here in my office at Beit Avichai, and an email came over from Mosaic to say that there was a new posting of Ruth Wisse and an introduction and a new translation of Chaim Grade's incredible essay called My Quarrel with Hersh Rasseyner. I've read Chaim Grade. I've read the Yeshiva, as I'm sure most of you have as well, my mother's Sabbath days and other things. But as I thought about it, I took the essay home, and I must have stayed up till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. This incredible introduction that Ruth wrote, the translation, the way that the essay speaks to you in a very personal way, as if it was written today and not all those years ago when Chaim Grade first penned it. I have to say, I'm very excited about this evening. I want to thank my friend, my teacher, Ruth Wisse, for joining us, my friend Asael Abelman. I cannot wait to listen to their analysis, to their interpretation of an essay that means as much today as it did when it was first written. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, David, for the lovely introduction, but particularly for letting Asael and me resume some of the teaching that we've done together in the past. It is such a pleasure to be here with you, Asael, and especially talking about this story. You know, people may ask, why this story? And from my point of view, I have to say that from the moment I began teaching Yiddish literature, both in the original and in translation, this story was just a natural. It's as if it was written by Chaim Grade with the very purpose to become a text in an ongoing kind of Talmudic conversation that we can use with our own students. And it lends itself so much to discussion and to thought. Of course, many people have written about this essay. Serious thinkers have addressed it. But I think that it's always refreshing to come back to it. And I think that's why we chose to talk about it today. Where should we begin, do you think?
First of all, we'll begin with me saying how excited I am to teach with you again, Ruth, even for a short while, and even without being with you in the classroom. I really missed you. We haven't been together, I think, before the Corona started, so I'm just delighted to do this. Maybe we'll start. I have to ask you about Chaim Grade himself. I know you've met him at least once. So maybe tell us something about his personality, his life.
Well, I think that would require kind of shifting from a discussion of the story to shifting about him, but just very briefly about his life, which, by the way, is important because he uses himself, or a version of himself, as one of the main characters in this story. So it is based on events that he drew from his own biography. He was born in 1910 in Vilna. He was the only child of his mother, but his mother was the second wife of his father, who was older. His father was a Talmid Chacham, a learned Jew, but also learned in secular things in which he had educated himself. But the mother very much wanted her son to be a rabbi. Unfortunately, the father died when he was about bar mitzvah age, and from that time on, he was sent off to yeshivot. And he grew up, basically, in yeshivot, the last of them being the Musar yeshiva in Novarodok that had moved from Russia. When it became Soviet Russia, it moved to Bialystok in Poland. And he was a student there for a number of years until in 1930, he could not bear it any longer. And he decided that he would have to leave and go back to Vilna. So he left the yeshiva, came back to Vilna, and he joined a group of writers in the city called Jung Vilna, a very active group of writers. By the way, most of them were poets. And so he too became a poet. And he immediately became quite well known. His first book was published in 1936. It was called Ja, yes, very affirmative. And from then on, he went on to really become as well known as a young poet could become in those years, not just locally, but also beginning to have an international reputation as well. Of course, then came the war. The part of Poland in which Vilna found itself was not attacked immediately by Germany, but it was taken by the Soviet Union. And so for 2 years, they were under Soviet rule. And then in 1941, the Germans attacked. And Chaim Grade and his wife, whom he recently married, fled. He made it into the Soviet interior, but she decided that she would go back. And everybody thought that she would be safe, of course, because no one was going to harm the women and children, as they thought. So, of course, she was killed during the war with her parent, with her mother, with Chaim Grade's mother, and all the Jews of the great majority of Jews of Vilna. He spent the war years in the Russian interior. Then he made his way back to Vilna. From Vilna, he got to Paris, and he stayed there until from 1946 to 1948. And in 1948, he came to New York. Now, this story is situated in 3 periods, but most of the story takes place in 1948. And is situated based on his experiences there in France. But he wrote the story already when he was in the United States, and it was there that it was published in 1952.
Right, so Ruth, before we move into the story, please, if you can just say something, even something small about your meeting with him, the impression he left on you.
Well, he left the impression I had of him was of tremendous intelligence. The first time I really met him was when I was a graduate student at Columbia in 1960, yes, I think it was in 1960, and I went to a lecture of his on the culture of the Jews of Eastern Europe. It was a marvelous lecture. And afterwards, I was invited out with him and with his publisher for a wonderful evening at the Russian Tea Room in New York. I felt that this was so glamorous, and the whole evening felt to me such a success. He was in a terrible mood, and to him the evening was a failure. He had not managed to say everything that he had wanted to say. The audience was not as responsive as he thought it should have been. And I saw that this was a man who was compulsively self-critical. And in fact, one of the things that he said at that time was, look, when I am reading Dostoevsky, I always feel that I should be studying the Talmud. And when I'm studying the Talmud, I always feel that I should be reading Dostoevsky. And it's as if these were the 2 parts of him that were tearing apart. And so it's not unusual that this story before us is written in this form of 2 parts of 2 people, actually, but these are kind of 2 parts of him being torn apart.
Right. I think we do owe our audience just mentioning this extremely famous anecdote. I'll tell it, and then maybe you can say something about it. We verified that this is a true story. At some stage in the East Coast after the Shoah, Chaim Grade is walking in some place, and someone asks him to come into shul to daven mincha. And he says, I've done it already. So the other person says, how can it be? It's only 12 in the 12 and a half in the afternoon. And he said, I davened in August 1939.
I see. Well, I would believe this anecdote. It's appropriate to him. And it goes back to what I was saying of a person who is very strict with himself and also keeping account of whether it's appropriate to daven from one point of view, you see, after the beginning of the Churban, of the Shoah. So yes, I think that anecdote sort of rings true. And it's a hard story. That hardness, that part of him is really tough. I think that it might be helpful if you want to introduce the story as you see it. I mean, sort of how you see the plot in the story developing.
Okay, so let's dive into the story itself. And for those who are listening or watching us and haven't read it yet, we can just say that it is a short story, and it's based on an ongoing conversation between two people, Chaim himself and Hersh. They went to yeshiva together before the war, and obviously Chaim Grade, or the person who's telling the story, has left the world of yeshiva and became a secular Jewish writer. Hersh himself remains very strongly in the world of yeshiva, and everything that he learned when he was young is still it's part of his life, and he teaches, etc., etc. They have one meeting or two meetings before the Shoah, and as you said, the main meeting is in Paris in 1948 after the Shoah. And I think this is a very long argument. First of all, about their relationship. We'll say a few things about it later, maybe, if it's is it a love story, or how much do they hate each other. But besides that, it's a long conversation about identity, faith, Jewish history, Jews and Gentiles and their relationship. We have to say something about God in the story. We'll probably get to that towards the end. But I do want to say something about the fact that the story does take place in 1948, and then I want to ask you something about it. I heard a few times from the Israeli writer David Grossman something that he tells about his childhood. He's a young child in Jerusalem in the 1950s, and his parents have all these books of Shalom Aleichem. And he reads the stories, Motel ben Pesi, and Tevya, and Menachem Mendel, and he tries to understand who are these figures, where does one fit them in time and space. And then he explains that as the years go by and he grows up in an Israeli school, and he goes through all these ceremonies for the Shoah, what we call the Tekes Yom HaShoah, he suddenly has this insight that all the people who were murdered in the Shoah are actually these characters that Shalom Aleichem is describing. So I think my question is, we usually read the Yiddish literature, Peretz, and Shalom Aleichem, and Gladstein, etc., etc., and we usually get this description of Jewish life with all its dimensions before 1939. And for me, at least, it's not like a natural thing to read about, a Yiddish text reflecting Jewish life after the Shoah. And this is what we have over here. I really want to ask you, how special and unique is this, and what does it mean?
Well, it's a terrifically challenging question. Because there's no question that Grade was very much aware of Yiddish literature and of Yiddish culture and so forth. And this story is written, as you may be implying, a little bit against the grain, or very much against the grain, of this impression that this person has of Yiddish literature based on having read Shalom Aleichem and Peretz, and maybe Yiddish humor, and thinking of it as that world of the shtetl and so forth. This story is quite different. It's very intellectual. And incidentally, those two meetings before and then in 1948 are very significant. The first meeting is between these two 7 years after Chaim Vilner, as he characterizes himself in the story, as he was called in the yeshiva, 7 years after he has left the yeshiva. And he's just come back to Bialystok now to give a talk as a poet. But he misses Hersh Rasseyner, who was his best friend, and he looks for him, but he doesn't show up at the talk. But one day he meets him in the street. That's their first encounter. And you see how angry it is, because they are each still in that position of one is there and the other one has left, and they cannot forgive each other for it. And that's where the two images of the Musar yeshiva, which, by the way, is a special kind of yeshiva, it was very strict. The Musar yeshiva was about the cultivation of the personality, which is a wonderful idea, that you don't just study the Talmud, but you have to cultivate the personality. But the way the Navaradok branch of Musar enforced that was to really be, to try to get the ego completely crushed. And as a matter of fact, Grade, in another work, had described that the Rosh Yeshiva shamed him before the whole yeshiva one day. Why? Because they found a comb in his pocket. Imagine the vanity of a boy who's carrying a comb in his pocket. So that's the way in which Chaim Vilner sees the yeshiva as a very repressive place. If you have studied Musar, you can never be happy in your life. But he has become a poet, and Rasseyner is very hard on him and says, oh, it's all vanity. All you care about is to have your name on the cover of a book. And so they go at each other like fighters, but intellectual and moral antagonists. So that's the first thing. And Chaim Vilner in the first part has the last word. He accuses Hersh of hiding from the world. You think that you're moral, but it's not. You're being supported by these women in Vilna who work for you, but I'm the one who cares about them. And he has the upper hand. Then the second little part, they meet 2 years later when the Soviets have entered Vilna. And the Soviets are already as repressive in their own way as the Nazis will be. However, they're not killing the Jews. They're merely killing those who are anti-communist. Those they are killing. So the atmosphere is very, very tense. And here is very interesting. Rasseyner says to Vilner, they can't talk openly anymore because they're too scared. Both of them are scared to be overheard. But Rasseyner accuses Vilner, you're responsible for this. See, is this what you wanted? And Vilner says, listen, I'm no more responsible for them than you are for me. And here it's Rasseyner who has the last word, right? He says, oh, Chaim, but I am responsible for you. Meaning, and you are responsible for them, because the way of life that you choose is not just personal, but it reflects on what history is going to do with that choice, right? So just to get to your point, though, and then is the most amazing transition. How do we get from 1941 to 1948? It says, and another 2 years passed, if I can find, 2 years passed, and this is, 9 years passed, 9 years passed, years of war and destruction during which I wandered across Russia, Poland, and Western Europe. Zehu, that's it. And Asael, this is so remarkable. That is the only reference, basically, to those 9 years in between. So what the whole world is preoccupied with, the Shoah, those 9 years, what happened, Grade in this story wanted to say that conversation, that argument between those two, it started, it continued, and after the war, it picks up as if nothing happened in between. So to me, that sentence is sort of the key of everything. It's 9 years past. Do you think I'm going to stand here and talk about German history? What the Germans did to us? Not my concern. I'm back there with you, kid. And that same argument that we had has not been resolved. In fact, it's been intensified. Right? And so that's how they continue. And here's something interesting. You know, they made a movie of this play, and I think the filmmakers had this idea that, wait a minute, if these two men who are actually in a film, they have to be humanized. If these two men meet again, wouldn't they talk about what happened? Who is still alive? Who is dead? So the film and the play that they made of this fills in all that the story leaves out. And it's so interesting to see the film, right, so that we can compare. Would you like to see a clip, a part of that, where this happens?
Yes, sure.
So the clip shows you how they filled in all that is missing in the story.
Okay, so let's watch it.
Okay, great.
I was with them in the ghetto. As Hersh and I walked together, I remembered how Joseph, after years of separation in Egypt, revealed himself to his brothers. I am Joseph, your brother. Is our father still alive?
Officer got nervous.
I knew my parents had been killed by the Nazis. I even knew how. But I needed to hear it again.
So he marched everyone into the woods and had them dig their own, All over Europe, the trains were transporting Jews to their end. And that day in Bialystok.
It was the strangest feeling. Walking, almost strolling in the sunshine, talking about the murders of people dearest to us.
And you? Auschwitz. But they moved me to a work camp, Częstochowa. That I'm alive is a miracle.
Hersh?
Pesha and both children. You?
I lost everyone. I was married, Hersh.
I heard.
2 boys. I was in Vilna.
I know.
I fled to Russia with a close friend, running like scared dogs through the countryside. I left Sarah and the boys behind. I was told the Nazis, they only wanted the men for the work camps, so only the men. Who could have guessed, Hersh? I made the wrong choice. In Russia, I stayed alive by believing I would see them again.
There was no right choice. Chaim, it doesn't help to blame yourself.
Avram? Itzik? Alter Laser? Jezel?
Hazel's alive. He's in Australia. All right. Oh. Chaim, I have to tell you something. I always thought about you in the camp. I was always haunted by the terrible fight that we had when you left yeshiva. Sometimes I thought that God was keeping me alive so that I could see you one more time and I could ask you to forgive me. Please, Chaim Kovler, for everything that I did to you when we were in Bialystok, please forgive me.
Bialystok? I forgave you long ago. I acted without thinking. I mean, I am the one who needs to be forgiven. Chaim Koppler and Hersh Rasseyner.
So Ruth, what you're saying is, or are you saying this is not a story about the Shoah, actually? Is that correct?
Yes. This is exactly what I am saying. It's a story set completely in a historical context. You can't avoid the history because he builds in the history. But he builds in the history, I think, in order to make one of the main things that happens is that we just go over that period and we do not linger in it. And you see how moving the movie is. I mean, it's very, I'm sure that there are people watching who wished, hey, now I'm going to see this movie, The Quarrel. It's so affecting. The story is not affecting in that way. It does not ever try to work on your emotions in that particular way, and it does not try to involve you in anything that actually happened to human beings during the Shoah. It goes to the heart of the question. These two people accuse one another. One says, after what happened, this is 1948, after what happened, how can you go on believing in God? And Rasseyner says, what? After what happened, how can you go on believing in man? And that becomes the crux of the argument. So yes, they love one another, and there is this sense of, connectedness. But you picked up something in the story, I think, that affected you, and probably because of contemporary, the way it's still applicable today. You picked up on really how anti-Haredi Vilner really is, how he has never lost that anger about what the Haredi world can do to you. And that is really a very strong part of the story.
Right. In his opening words, David said how relevant the story is. I think this dimension you just mentioned now is important. I don't know how it goes on the American street, but in Israel, I think this criticism, sometimes even hatred from the secular intellectual, secular Jewish intellectual towards the people from the yeshiva, the Haredim, something that you can find very easily on television, newspaper, on the street. So it seems like it's something one can identify or at least recognize. Look, Grade, or what his character, Chaim, he definitely is defending art, culture, science, and the fact that the story does take place in Paris is very interesting. I picked up this, it's like a theme in the story, Hirsch's eyes. Hersh looks at things, and there's some kind of light coming out of his eyes. And during the story, Chaim asks him, he actually begs him, Hersh, please look at these statues and the light that comes out of their eyes. And it's like the question over here, like reflecting what you brought up. Can you believe in God? How can you believe in God? How can you believe in man? Are these statues in Paris? Is this some kind of magic? Something very beautiful, or is this avodah zarah, idolatry? And what this French Parisian scenery, one can again feel this conflict. And then suddenly comes in this Talmid, this pupil of Hersh, Yoshua. And he brings with him something even more difficult for Chaim, because he's extremely gruff. And one really can't stand him. I can say about myself, and as a reader, Yoshua is almost impossible. So this conflict over here is still very, very relevant to us.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. By the way, Yehoshua was so impossible for Milton Himmelfarb, the brilliant first translator of the story into English, that they removed Yehoshua from the story because they thought that Yehoshua's gruffness, this young boy who is being raised in the Musar style very ferociously and who attacks the secular Jew for being secular, for being an unbeliever, they thought that it weakened the story. The translator decided and the editors decided that it weakened the story. So we have to go back and think, well, but Grade is the master story writer here. He left this in. And I think that you're right. That is the harshest criticism. What kind of a personality are you actually cultivating in your Haredi style of Judaism? Isn't it coarse compared to the light coming from the statues? And by the way, you make a wonderful point about the light, because the strongest argument that Chaim Vilner makes for Paris, for this civilization, is that you see a person who makes a statue, he can represent all of mankind. And he can elevate you through this idea of exposing you to something more wonderful than yourself, you see. So in a way, that is the positive side that Chaim Vilner is trying to present, using Paris at its best as his model, as his evidence. Let me push back, though, because from my reading of it, the main reason for writing this story was not to continue his argument with Musar, although that's a huge part, as you say. The far stronger and more difficult part of this story, the part that no one else could have written, the attacks on Haredim, as you say, you can find so many of them, you can hardly find anything else, because it's, after all, a liberal culture, and he's writing within a liberal medium of modern literature. But the voice that he gives to Rasseyner to attack the worst of Western civilization, that you can find nowhere else. And, you know, I mean, there's so many pages of it. It is such a harsh criticism. I would just, you know, maybe read a little example. The question hasn't changed, he says, about the great people of reason, the great school of Athens, all this great civilization that you're trying to, you know, promote here. Did they really live as they taught, or did their system remain only a system? You must understand once and for all that when his reason is calm and pure, a man does not know how he will act when his dark desire overtakes him. A man is dazzled by his own wisdom and proud of his knowledge. But as soon as a little desire stirs in him, he forgets all his learning. His senses are stronger than his reason. Reason is like a trained dog who follows sedately in his master's footsteps until he sees a bitch. I mean, that's just a fraction of Rasseyner's brilliant, energetic attack on how Western civilization can lead to Hitler, essentially. And that's basically what he's saying. Look, Germany and France, Look at these wonderful countries, but look what became of them overnight. You know, so and you're measuring that against Jewish civilization, the training of halachic way of life, which trains you, and you have to follow the halacha. You don't trust your reason, you don't trust this, but your senses, you don't follow your senses. You follow how you have been trained to act. You could never stoop to that. So for Rasseyner, you see, he's not using the argument how high a civilization can raise, because he doesn't trust that at all. Look, nobody rose higher than the Germans. I mean, Germany was the epitome of civilization, and France as well. And look what became of it. So he is saying, look what we have to guard against. Isn't that what we learned in Musar? How can you throw that over? It's a very, very powerful argument that he makes.
Tell me, Ruth, is that very unique for Chaim God as a generation, his, you know, his friends in his time, the statement against enlightenment? Would you say that's very special?
I would say the way he makes the argument is very special and very difficult, Asael, because I think that the world that he was living in 1948, you know, you would think that many people were thinking like Hersh Rasseyner, but that's not true. In the circles that he was living in Paris and then after in New York, they were very, we would say, left-leaning, especially in the Yiddish community. Many of them were still, you know, very closely attached to communism and to the former Soviet Union. And he is, of course, you know, to be a Yiddish writer, a modern Yiddish writer, is to be, in a sense, a liberal thinking person. So you see that Chaim Vilner, in making these arguments, is making them, in a way, on behalf of that. And yet, he is using the story to make the strongest case possible for the argument against it, that it is not sufficient, and that it doesn't work, that it's not a question of how sweetly you can talk, or, you know, the plays that Shakespeare can write, or anything that's marvelous in that world. That's not the way we measure these two paths. We measure these paths by the worst that they can fall to. And when you take that measurement, there's just no argument. Judaism has protected us from all of that. And he makes the case very strongly for that, and also even more strongly against the high claims that one tries to make for Western civilization. That's one of the reasons that this story is so powerful. And I think you were once surprised when I told you that in teaching the story, I sometimes, I don't think it's a good question, by the way, but I sometimes have asked students at the end of discussing it, I say, tell me, if we were to judge this as a debate, which side do you think wins? Who do you think wins the debate? And really, it's surprising. Most of the time, students think that Rasseyner wins the debate, right? On debating points. Of course, it's much easier to win when we take Yehoshua, that little nasty little boy, out of the story.
Right.
But even when he's in the story, they feel that if you go through the text and you see the strength of the arguments that are made, they are extremely compelling. Should we watch one more clip as to to see
Yes.
about how that argument is made? Great.
Chaim! Chaim! I should have tried to stop it. He's a very young boy. All he knows is that you once touched the beauty of the Torah and that you left. You should forgive him.
Forgive him? You're the one who filled his heart with hatred.
It's not hatred, Chaim. distance. I have to teach them this way or we won't survive.
If this is all that you have to offer, it's better that we not survive.
Better for who? Hitler murdered 6 million. Now you want to finish the job for him?
You are crazy. You hear that? You are crazy and cruel.
Wake up, Chaim. Look around you. We are living in a broken world. In Bialystok, maybe I could have taught them that the Torah had 70 faces of truth, each face a different reality, but not now.
Yes, now. We are a devastated people. This is precisely why we should start to treasure each other like you would treasure a rare jewel. Be tolerant.
These children are our last hope to save what we once had in Bialystok.
Don't want any part of your vision. The world on one side, we, the chosen people, on the other.
We are. God chose us.
Yes, God chose us to be burned, to be slaughtered, to be hanged.
He also chose us to keep the Torah. Chaim, let me tell you something. When I was lying on the ground in the camp, and the German was kicking me with his boots, if an angel of God had come down and bent and whispered in my ear, Hersh, Hersh, just give me the word, and in the twinkle of an eye, I will turn you into the German. I'll put his uniform on you, I'll give you his murderous face, and the German will become you. If an angel of God had given me that choice, do you hear me, Chaim? I never would agree. The German's boots on my face, I could, with God's help, survive. But if I have to pull his mask on my face, that would choke me like I was breathing gas. When the German screamed at me, "You are a slave," I whispered, "Master of the universe, you have chosen me."
For someone who chooses to be a victim, you have too much hatred. I do not believe you. And I know that when you'll have power, you'll use it. And I know who will be the first victim. It will be me.
Chaim, I loved you like a brother. I always loved you. Still love you. You can accuse me of being Cain. I mean, I don't agree with you, that's all.
No, that's not all. It's not that you don't agree with me, it's that you are denying who I am. Just the way you denied me when I left the yeshiva.
Your memory is very cloudy.
Oh, no, you are the one who slammed the door in my face and erased me from your life.
We remember what we want to remember.
What's this supposed to mean?
I know what I'm talking about. When you left the yeshiva, you weren't happy enough just to go. You tried to convince me to go with you.
I wanted to show you the world.
And when that failed, you attacked me. I didn't know what you were doing then. I respected you. I knew that you were smarter than me. I took everything that you said very, very seriously. And now I see it. You used me.
This is not true.
You tried to disrupt my life because you were having doubts about your own.
Hersh, hear me.
I was broken when you left. It took me years to regain my faith. Even in Chenstochova, I was struggling with you. And now you can accuse me of denying you. It's not me that you see. It's always been you, always been you. The question between us, Chaim, even now, is not what do I want from you? It's not what do you want from me? What do you want from yourself? I can't give you my blessing, Chaim. I don't have it to give.
Okay, so Ruth, I think we're moving into the last stage of our conversation. I do want to bring up two issues, very serious ones, should take hours to discuss, but I think even if we're limited in time, we have to approach them. One is about Akadosh Baruch Hu, God, and then we have to say, I think, something about Zionism. So let me ask you a question and see, I'm interested to see where you take it. During the conversation, towards the end of the story, Hersh does mention this very beautiful saying from the Talmud that Hashem, Kadosh Baruch Hu, has himself a tefillin shel Rosh. And the Talmud asks what's written in there, and the answer is Mi ke'amcha Yisrael. who is like your people, Israel. So that's what God has on his forehead. And of course, they're debating about Jewish culture versus enlightenment, etc. But still, Chaim has to explain to Hersh, and Hersh has to explain to Chaim what does faith in God mean after the Shoah. Now, I do remember, I read this somewhere, that the great writer and poet, Yiddish poet in Jerusalem, Leib Rochman, when young Israelis would ask him, where was God in the Shoah? He used to say, he was with us. So how strong is the theological dimension in this short story?
Well, you have brought it out. I mean, I think that I think that you put your finger on the theological dimension in the story. But even from what you were saying, I think that the theological element within the story expresses itself most powerfully within the negative arguments on both sides, rather than the positive. The positive argument is less for a mystical approach or a spiritual approach per se than a very practical one. The arguments are very practical in terms of what is civilization. And again, the strongest negative arguments are the ones that are given to Hersh Rasseyner against the secular Jew and his choice to run away from the halachic bounds and boundaries of Judaism. We've talked about, the attack that Rasseyner mounts against Western civilization, but after that encounter with Yehoshua, he really singles out for attack the Jewish secularist. And he goes on and on about the Jews, right, who choose the Enlightenment. And he says, when you run away from being Jewish, you disguise your flight with high-sounding phrases. An enlightened man would talk in the most elevated rhetoric about enlightenment, but what he really had in mind was to become a druggist. Right? And he goes on in that vein, and he says, with the nations of the world, the main thing is the individual, his sovereignty, his pleasure, his peace of mind. But they also know that if they acted on the principle that might makes right, one man would devour another. So they settled on a government of individuals. Let me alone, and I will let you alone. And here's his crux of this argument. With us Jews, it's the individual. The individual is not the essence, he says. It's the community that counts. What's good for Klal Yisrael must be good for Reb Yisrael. So there, I mean, maybe that's just the level of the story with which I feel more comfortable. But I think that the truth is that that is the ground, I think, on which he makes the case. That, for example, yes, it's true. I'm not going to argue with you, Chaim Vilner. To be a secular Jew means that you can act as an individual, the freedom of the individual, and then you have a government of individuals and all the... With us Jews, the individual is not where you put the emphasis. It is Klal Yisrael. And the individual has to see himself as part of that community and all the rest of it. Would one call this a theological argument, you see? It is a theological argument insofar as the directive to be that people comes from God. But the way in which Rasseyner has experienced it and is expressing it has to do really with the practical way in which a community constitutes itself. And, interestingly enough, I would say if one looks at Israel, I don't see that in some ways one can really differentiate between the secular Jews and the religious Jews in the way in which they behave as a community. the protectiveness that people feel for one another. I feel that's a quality that is equally strong among many secular Jews we know in Israel and many religious Jews whom we know. The sense of having to fight to protect the country is no stronger within one part of that community than another. So the ethos of Judaism, to some extent, seems to have found its way into the Jewish people in Israel in a very, very strong way, as it's expressed in this story, even though, of course, the argument and the tensions still remain tremendously powerful.
Right. There are serious tensions. We'll definitely not get into them over here. But Ruth, because you brought it up, it is 1948, and Hersh tells Chaim he was actually in Morocco going to find some students for his yeshiva, which is extremely interesting. You know, there's a Yiddish text describing Moroccan Jewish children being brought to France. But I think it's worth mentioning at least that Zionism isn't an option over here. At the same time, you have people from the Sukhnut, from Eretz Israel. Soon the state of Israel, Medinat Israel, will themselves go to Morocco and North Africa and other places to bring children to the new state. Hersh is doing something completely different. He's bringing them to Europe. For Chaim Vilner, this isn't, it's not on his horizon at all. What do you make of that? That the eyes are not, there aren't any eyes to the east over here?
It's a very important question, actually, and many people are left at the end of the story. Why is there not positive resolution where they both could have gotten up and they both could have left for Eretz Yisrael and continued the argument there? Well, they don't. I think part of it, one may say, I think that's the shallowest level of answering the question, is biographical. Chaim Grade himself had stepbrothers, the brothers of his father's first marriage, who lived in America. And so he came to America. So he did not consider settling in Eretz Yisrael. And since so much of his fiction is based on his own experiences, he couldn't take his characters in a direction that he did not choose. So since this was not his answer, as it were, he did not build that answer into the story. But I would say that's not where I would place the emphasis. I think the emphasis is rather that just as he did not want to settle the story in discussing the Shoah per se, so he did not want to take the story in the direction of a political resolution. Even of a political national resolution. I think that he felt that this argument between Rasseyner and Vilner on the question of secularism, whether the Jews were going to become a secular people or whether they were going to remain a halachic people, this was the issue. The story is so concentrated, the argument is so furiously concentrated that you're right, it doesn't move outward at all, right? It doesn't take us to anywhere else. They sit there, the day goes on, they don't really move very far from one place to the other. And the argument doesn't move very far from one place to the other. So I think that that's the main thing, that he really felt that he was presenting us with an argument that continues, that we dare not lose sight of, that we have to have the strength to take seriously and to air it, to understand what's at stake on both sides. And I'm not sure that the story has a resolution of any kind. At the end of the story is, all that Chaim Vilner can say is, look, may we meet again, and may we still be able to meet and love each other. He he doesn't ask for anything more. And by the way, it's because, in a way, he needs Hersh Rasseyner more than Hersh Rasseyner needs him. Hersh Rasseyner can go on without him. He doesn't want to, as he says in that clip in the movie, you know, I love you, you know, and I've always been in argument with you, and so on. I need you. But it's basically Wilner who has to depend on Rasseyner keeping the Jewish people alive in order for him to have some place to return to. So that's a strength. And yet, Wilner does end the story. And, and as you said very rightly, I think the last thing to be said is, he writes the story, basically. It's Chaim Wilner, right?
So the conversation, like when you read a page from the Gemara, from the Talmud, it's going to continue the conversation only with the hope that one can love the other, and maybe even, I think they hope to kiss each other eventually when they meet again. So there's no resolution, but the discussion goes on.
Absolutely, and how wonderful it is to have the discussion with you, and within this context that we've been privileged to enjoy.
Yes, I had a wonderful time, Ruth. So we're recording this before Rosh Hashanah, so I have to tell you Shana Tova. I have to tell you I miss you, and I'm going to send you a kiss now, okay?
Nishikot. Shana Tova.